The restaurant was already busy when the evening shift began. Soft lights reflected off polished tables, and quiet music floated through the air. The place was known for fine food, expensive wine, and guests who spoke in low, confident voices. People came here to celebrate, to impress, or to close important deals. Every detail mattered, from the shine on the floor to the way the staff moved without being noticed. Among the staff was a young waitress who had worked there for more than a year. She wore the same uniform as everyone else, neat and simple, and her hair was tied back tightly. She moved carefully between tables, balancing trays, listening closely to orders, and offering polite smiles. She was good at her job, but she never tried to stand out. In a place like this, being invisible often felt safer. Her shift had started like any other. She checked her section, wiped down tables, and greeted guests as they arrived. Most customers barely looked at her. Some nodded, some spoke kindly, and a few acted as if she were part of the furniture. She was used to all of it. She had learned long ago not to take things personally. This job paid the bills, and for now that was enough. As the evening went on, the restaurant grew louder. Plates clinked, glasses filled, and laughter rose and fell in waves. In the corner of the room stood an old grand piano. It was large and beautiful but rarely used. Sometimes, on special nights, a hired musician would play soft background music. Most of the time, it simply sat there, quiet and untouched, like a forgotten memory. The waitress passed by the piano several times while serving drinks. Each time, her eyes lingered for just a second longer than necessary. No one noticed. To everyone else, it was just decoration. To her, it carried a weight she tried not to think about. That night, a group of well-dressed guests entered the restaurant together. Their arrival was hard to miss. Conversations paused, and a few heads turned. At the center of the group was a man whose presence filled the room without effort. He walked with confidence, spoke with ease, and was greeted warmly by the manager. It was clear he was important. The staff quickly adjusted. Tables were rearranged, menus were brought out, and the best service was assigned to that section. The waitress was asked to help serve the group. She nodded and did as she was told, though a small knot of tension formed in her chest. High-profile guests often meant higher pressure. One mistake could cost a lot. As she approached the table for the first time, she noticed how relaxed the man seemed. He laughed easily, spoke loudly, and made the people around him laugh as well. He ordered without looking at the menu for long, clearly familiar with places like this. When she took his order, he glanced at her briefly, then looked away. Nothing about that moment felt unusual. Time passed and the food was served. The waitress moved back and forth between tables, refilling glasses and clearing plates. She stayed focused, but she could feel the energy in the room changing. The group at the large table was enjoying themselves, growing louder, more confident as the night went on. At one point, the man leaned back in his chair and glanced around the restaurant. His eyes landed on the piano. He stared at it for a moment, then smiled as if an idea had crossed his mind. He said something to the people around him and they laughed. The waitress was nearby when she heard him ask about the piano. One of the staff explained that it was sometimes used for live music. The man seemed interested. He asked if anyone was playing that night. When told no, he shrugged and took a sip of his drink. The moment passed, or so it seemed. Later, as the waitress returned to the table with dessert plates, she heard her name being spoken. Startled her. Guests rarely used staff names. She stopped and looked up. The man was looking directly at her now, his expression curious. He asked her a simple question almost casually. Had she ever played the piano? The question caught her off guard. For a second, she thought she had misheard him. Her heart beat faster. She hesitated, then answered honestly but carefully. She said she had learned a little a long time ago. She tried to sound unimportant, hoping the conversation would end there. But it didn't. The man's interest grew. He asked a few more questions, light and playful, but they made her uncomfortable. People at nearby tables began to listen. She could feel eyes on her again, and this time, she wished they weren't there. She tried to redirect the conversation back to her work. She mentioned the dessert options and offered to bring coffee. Normally, that would have been enough. Tonight, it wasn't. The man smiled and leaned forward slightly. He spoke louder now, clearly enjoying the attention. He joked about hidden talents and unexpected surprises. Laughter spread around his table. Some guests looked amused. Others looked curious. The waitress felt her face grow warm. She stood there, holding her tray, unsure of what to do. She hadn't thought about the piano in years. That part of her life felt far away, almost unreal. This restaurant, this uniform, this routine was her reality now. She gave a small polite laugh and said she needed to check on another table. She turned to leave, hoping the moment would pass. But as she walked away, she could still feel the weight of his gaze. In the background, the piano remained silent. The rest of her shift should have continued as normal. Orders needed to be filled. Tables needed to be cleared. But something had changed. A sense of unease followed her with every step. She replayed the brief conversation in her mind, wondering why such a simple question had shaken her so deeply. She told herself it was nothing, just a rich guest making conversation. Still, she avoided looking in that direction when she could. She focused on her work, on the steady rhythm of serving and cleaning, on anything that would keep her thoughts quiet. Yet, every time she passed the piano, she felt a pull she couldn't explain. The night was far from over, and without knowing it, she was standing at the edge of a moment that would soon pull her out of the background and into the center of the room. The calm of the restaurant held, but just beneath the surface, something was about to change. The rest of the evening moved forward, but it no longer felt normal. The restaurant was still full, the lights still warm, the music still soft, yet the waitress felt like she was walking through a different place. Her hands kept working, carrying plates and glasses, but her thoughts stayed elsewhere. Every few minutes, her eyes drifted toward the large table where the well-known guest sat laughing with his group. She told herself to stay focused. Many shifts were long and tiring, and guests often asked strange questions. This should have been no different. Still, the way he had looked at her, the way he had said her name, stayed in her mind. It wasn't rude, but it wasn't harmless either. It felt like curiosity mixed with confidence, the kind that assumed everything was possible. As she poured water for another table, she noticed the manager watching the room closely. The manager had worked in this place for years and knew how to read people. Important guests meant reputation, and reputation meant business. The waitress wondered if the manager had noticed the earlier exchange. So, nothing had been said yet. She returned to the kitchen to pick up more orders. The kitchen was loud and hot, filled with the smell of food and the sound of voices calling out orders. It usually felt grounding, a place where she could breathe for a moment. Tonight, even that didn't help much. One of the other servers asked if she was all right. She smiled and said she was fine. It was easier than explaining. When she stepped back into the dining area, she saw the man again, this time standing. He was talking to the manager now, gesturing lightly with one hand. The manager nodded and smiled, clearly eager to keep him happy. A small wave of worry passed through her chest. She slowed her pace, pretending to adjust a tray while listening from a distance. She couldn't hear the words clearly, but she noticed the way the manager glanced toward the piano. Then, just for a moment, both of them looked in her direction. She looked away quickly. A few minutes later, the manager approached her. The manager's voice was calm, professional, but there was something careful in the tone. She was told that the guest had asked about the piano again. The manager added that it was nothing serious, just conversation. Still, the manager asked her quietly if she was comfortable with attention. The question made her uneasy. She nodded, unsure what else to do. Saying no felt risky. Jobs like this were hard to find, and she couldn't afford problems. The manager told her to continue working as usual and walked away. The waitress stood still for a moment, then returned to her duties. Her heart beat a little faster now. She avoided the piano entirely, choosing longer paths around the room just to stay away from it. At the large table, the man had returned to his seat. He was speaking animatedly, clearly enjoying himself. Every so often, he glanced around the room, as if searching for something. When his eyes met hers again, he smiled. She gave a polite nod and looked away. Guests at nearby tables had begun to sense something unusual. People notice when energy shifts. Some whispered to each other. Others simply watched, curious but quiet. The restaurant felt like it was holding its breath. The waitress delivered another round of drinks to the table. This time, the man spoke again, louder than before. He joked about how interesting it was that people often carried stories no one knew about. He spoke as if telling a story, but his eyes stayed on her. She stood there, unsure whether to respond. One of the guests laughed and encouraged him to continue. Another guest seemed uncomfortable but said nothing. The waitress forced a small smile, waiting for the moment to pass. Then the man asked her very clearly if she would ever play again. The words landed heavily. The room didn't fall silent, but the sound seemed to fade slightly, as if people were listening more closely now. She felt the weight of every second as she searched for an answer. She said she didn't play anymore. Her voice was steady, but quiet. She added that it had been many years. She hoped that honesty would end the conversation. Instead, it fueled it. The man laughed softly and said that talent doesn't disappear. He spoke with certainty like someone used to being right. He made a comment about chances and how life sometimes hides surprises in unexpected places. The waitress felt exposed. She hadn't planned to share anything personal at work. This was supposed to be a safe space where she served food, not memories. She excused herself and moved away, her hands trembling slightly. In the kitchen, she paused, gripping the edge of the counter until the feeling passed. She reminded herself that she was in control. No one could force her to do anything. But when she stepped back out, she sensed that the evening was moving toward something she could not fully stop. The man stood again, raising his glass. He spoke loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. He talked about how moments become stories and how stories are worth witnessing. His guests smiled, enjoying the drama. The manager approached once more, this time looking more tense. The manager spoke quietly to the man, nodding politely. Then the manager turned toward the waitress and gestured gently for her to come closer. She felt a mix of fear and frustration. She walked over slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. The manager spoke softly, saying the guest was curious, nothing more. The manager said it was her choice, but added that the guest was offering a generous tip for a small moment of entertainment. The word entertainment stung. She looked around the room. Some guests avoided her eyes. Others watched openly now. She felt small, like she was standing on a stage without meaning to. She took a deep breath and said she needed a moment to think. The manager nodded and stepped back. The waitress moved away from the table and stood near the edge of the room. Her thoughts raced. She remembered long evenings from another time, sitting quietly, fingers moving across keys. She remembered how music once felt like home. She also remembered why she had stopped. The piano stood there, silent and patient, waiting. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation. No one spoke openly, but many were watching now. The waitress knew that whatever she decided, the night would not return to normal. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, steadying herself. The challenge had not yet been spoken aloud, but it was already there, hanging in the air, just seconds away from changing everything. She stood near the edge of the room, trying to slow her breathing. The noise of the restaurant returned in small waves, but it felt distant, like it was happening behind glass. Her thoughts were loud, too loud. She told herself she could say no and walk away. No one could force her to do anything. Still, the weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders. The manager gave her space, but stayed close enough to step in if needed. The man at the table watched her calmly, as if he already knew how this would end. That confidence unsettled her more than anything else. She had met many confident people before, but this felt different. Felt like being measured. She looked again at the piano. The surface reflected the lights above, smooth and dark. It hadn't changed, not really, but she had. Years had passed since she last touched keys like those. Back then, her hands were lighter, her heart more hopeful. Life had been simpler even when money was tight. She remembered small rooms with worn floors, the quiet sound of notes filling the air late at night. She remembered practicing when everyone else slept, because it was the only time she felt truly alone. Music had been a private place for her, not something to be shared or tested. A soft voice inside her reminded her why she had stopped. Bills had come first. Responsibilities followed. Dreams were set aside without ceremony. It wasn't dramatic. It just happened, one decision at a time. A chair scraped lightly against the floor behind her. Someone from another table leaned forward, whispering to a companion. The attention was spreading. She felt exposed, as if a light had been turned on without her permission. The man finally spoke again, this time clearly and openly. He said he didn't mean to make her uncomfortable. He said he admired courage, and that sometimes people needed a push to remember who they were. His words sounded smooth, practiced, almost kind, but they still carried pressure. He added that it would only be a few seconds, just a few notes, nothing serious. A few seconds. The phrase echoed in her mind. She knew better than anyone that a few seconds could change a lot. She looked at the manager. The manager met her eyes and gave a small nod, one that said the choice was hers. That nod didn't remove the pressure, but it gave her something solid to hold on to. She took another breath and spoke. Her voice was quiet, but steady. She said she hadn't played in a long time. She said she might not be very good anymore. She said she didn't want to disappoint anyone. The man smiled and replied that disappointment was part of life, and risk made things interesting. A few guests chuckled. Others watched in silence. The room felt balanced on a thin edge. She realized then that this was no longer just about the piano. It was about being seen, about whether she would remain invisible or step forward, even briefly. Slowly, she nodded. The movement was small, but it sent a ripple through the room. Conversations stopped more clearly now. Chairs shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The manager moved toward the piano and gently lifted the cover from the keys. The sound of the cover moving felt loud in the quiet room. She walked toward the piano with measured steps. Each one felt heavier than the last. She could feel her heart in her chest, steady but strong. When she reached the bench, she paused. Her hands hovered over the keys without touching them. She sat down carefully. The bench felt firm beneath her. She adjusted her posture without thinking, muscle memory guiding her. That small action surprised her. Some part of her still remembered. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys. They felt cool and smooth. For a moment she didn't move. She listened instead. She listened to the room, to her breathing, to the quiet hum of anticipation. Her mind tried to rush ahead, filling with doubt. What if her hands slipped? What if she forgot everything? What if the sound came out wrong? Then she stopped thinking. She pressed the first key. The note was soft, almost hesitant. It hung in the air, clear and simple. She pressed another, then another. The sound was familiar, like hearing an old friend's voice after many years. She kept going. The melody wasn't fast or loud. It didn't try to impress. It moved gently, steadily, guided by feeling rather than effort. Her hands began to relax. Her shoulders lowered without her noticing. The room grew still. People leaned in slightly, drawn by the sound. The man's confident smile faded into something quieter, more focused. Glasses stopped moving. Forks rested on plates. She forgot where she was. For a brief moment, the restaurant disappeared. There was only the piano, the sound, and the space between notes. Her fingers moved with more certainty now, finding patterns she hadn't planned. The music carried emotion she didn't have words for. She wasn't performing. She was remembering. The melody grew fuller, not louder but deeper. It filled the room without pushing against it. The sound reached tables far from the piano, wrapping softly around conversations that no longer existed. A guest near the back wiped at their eyes, surprised by their own reaction. Another sat with hands folded, staring openly. No one spoke. The waitress felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't pride. It was something calmer, something steadier. a sense of returning to herself. She finished the short piece naturally, letting the final note fade on its own. She didn't rush the ending. She allowed the silence that followed to settle. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then someone gasped. The sound broke the stillness, followed quickly by another. Chairs shifted. A breath was released somewhere nearby. The room seemed to wake up all at once. Applause did not come immediately. Instead, there was a moment of stunned quiet, as if people needed time to understand what they had just heard. She lifted her hands from the keys and rested them in her lap. They were no longer shaking. She stood slowly and turned to face the room. Every eye was on her now. The man rose from his seat, no longer smiling the same way. His expression had changed. There was respect there and something close to disbelief. The waitress felt suddenly very aware of herself again, of the uniform she wore, of the space she stood in. But the feeling was different now. She did not feel small. The room began to react, voices rising in soft amazement. The shift was clear. Whatever had started as a challenge had become something else entirely. She stepped back from the piano, her heart steady, knowing that the hardest part was already behind her, even though the night was far from over. The silence that followed her final note felt heavier than the music itself. It pressed gently against the walls, the tables, the people. No one rushed to speak. It was as if the room needed time to catch up with what had just happened. She stood near the piano, unsure where to place her hands, unsure where to look. Her heart beat steadily now, no longer racing. She felt exposed, but also strangely calm. The sound of her own breathing grounded her. Then the reaction began. A low murmur moved through the room like a wave. Someone whispered a soft word of surprise. Another person shook their head slowly, as if they could not believe what they had just heard. A few seconds later, applause broke out, careful at first, then stronger. It wasn't loud or wild. It was deep and sincere. She flinched slightly at the sound, then relaxed. She had not played for praise, but the recognition felt warm, not overwhelming. She offered a small nod, more out of habit than intention, and stepped back from the piano. The man at the table stood fully now. The playful confidence he had shown earlier was gone. In its place was a focused stillness. He clapped as well, slower than the others, his eyes never leaving her. When the applause faded, he spoke. His voice carried across the room, calm and clear. He said that moments like that were rare. He said that talent like that didn't vanish, even when life tried to bury it. His words were no longer a challenge. They sounded like acknowledgement. She listened quietly, unsure how to respond. Praise made her uncomfortable. Attention still felt strange on her skin. She thanked him softly and turned as if to return to work. But the night wasn't ready to let her disappear again. Several guests nearby spoke up, asking if she would play another piece. The request was gentle, respectful, not demanding. Others nodded in agreement. A few people smiled at her in a way that felt kind, not curious. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to retreat into routine, to pick up a tray and return to the safety of serving tables. Another part, smaller but growing, felt a pull she hadn't felt in years. She looked at the manager, who watched her carefully. The manager gave a small, encouraging smile. She sat back down at the piano. This time, her movements were less cautious. She adjusted the bench, placed her hands on the keys, and closed her eyes for a brief moment. She let herself remember why she had loved this in the first place. She began to play again. The second piece was different. Where the first had been quiet and reflective, this one carried movement. The notes flowed with more confidence, rising and falling like a steady breath. Her fingers moved freely now, guided by instinct rather than thought. The room leaned into the sound. People who had been halfway through meals stopped eating. Phones remained untouched. Even the kitchen noise seemed to soften, as if the building itself was listening. She felt present in a way she hadn't in a long time. Each note felt honest. Each pause had meaning. She was no longer thinking about how she looked or who was watching. She was simply playing. When she finished, the response was immediate. Applause filled the space, stronger this time, mixed with soft cheers and words of admiration. The sound startled her again, but she smiled before she could stop herself. She stood and stepped away from the piano, her hands slightly warm now, her chest full. She felt lighter, as if something heavy had been set down. The man approached her, careful not to crowd her space. He spoke quietly so only she and the manager could hear. He said he hadn't expected that. He said the room hadn't either. He thanked her for sharing something so personal. She nodded, unsure what to say. She appreciated the shift in his tone. Felt respectful now. The manager gently reminded her that she was still on shift. She smiled and returned to her duties, though the room no longer felt the same. As she walked between tables, guests looked at her differently. Some thanked her. Others offered warm smiles or brief words of encouragement. She accepted them politely, keeping her focus on her work. She didn't want the moment to turn into something overwhelming. As the evening continued, the energy in the restaurant stayed elevated. Conversations were brighter. Laughter came easier. It was as if the music had opened something in the space. The man and his group remained for a while longer, calmer now, more reflective. When it came time for them to leave, he asked to speak with her again. This time there was no audience. He told her that he supported art in different forms. He said he believed in creating opportunities where they were missing. He asked her if she had ever considered returning to music. The question landed gently. She answered honestly. She said she had thought about it many times but had never believed it was possible anymore. Life had taken her in a different direction. He nodded and said life often did that. He handed the manager a generous tip and left his contact information, saying there was no pressure, just an open door if she ever wanted to walk through it. She thanked him and watched as he left the restaurant with his group. When the door closed behind them, the room slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Plates were cleared. Music returned to the background. The piano stood quiet once more. But something had changed. As the night came to an end and the staff began to clean up, the waitress stood for a moment near the piano. She ran her fingers lightly along the edge, not playing, just feeling the smooth surface beneath her hand. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't know if she would ever play in a room like this again. But she knew one thing. She no longer felt invisible. The restaurant slowly emptied as the night moved toward its end. Chairs were pushed back under tables, candles burned low, and the soft background music returned to its usual place. From the outside, it looked like any other closing night. Inside, for her, nothing felt ordinary anymore. She continued working, clearing tables and wiping surfaces, but her movements felt lighter. Her mind replayed moments from earlier in the evening, not with fear this time, but with quiet wonder. She remembered the feeling of the keys under her fingers, the way the room had listened, the way the sound had filled spaces she didn't even know were empty. Other staff members treated her differently now. Not dramatically, not with envy, but with curiosity and respect. A few asked gentle questions. Where had she learned? Had she played for long? She answered briefly, not wanting to turn herself into a story. Still, she felt seen in a way she never had before. When the last guests left, the doors were locked and the lights were dimmed. The team gathered to finish closing duties. Normally, this part of the night felt exhausting. Tonight, it felt calm. The manager approached her once more, this time without the pressure of guests watching. The manager spoke honestly, saying the moment earlier had surprised everyone. The manager admitted they had no idea she could play like that. There was no judgment in the words, only truth. She nodded. She said she rarely talked about it. It had felt easier to leave that part of her life quiet. The manager understood. They spoke about how people carried many versions of themselves, and how sometimes those versions waited patiently to be noticed again. The conversation was simple, but it stayed with her. After her shift ended, she changed out of her uniform and stepped outside into the cool night air. The city sounds greeted her like an old rhythm. Cars passed. Voices echoed from a distance. Life continued as usual. She walked slowly, not rushing home. Her thoughts felt full but peaceful. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine something different. At home, her space was small and quiet. She placed her bag down and sat for a moment without turning on the lights. The silence felt familiar, but no longer heavy. She closed her eyes and listened, as if the music from earlier still lived in the air. She thought about the contact information left with the manager. She hadn't looked at it yet. The idea of reaching out felt both exciting and frightening. Opportunities had always felt like something meant for other people. She reminded herself that nothing had to change overnight. One moment did not erase years of reality. Still, something inside her had shifted. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual. Sunlight slipped through the window, soft and warm. She sat up slowly, feeling rested in a way she hadn't in months. As she went through her day, small things felt different. Sounds seemed sharper. Her steps felt steadier. She noticed music playing from a passing car and paused to listen. A simple tune from a street performer caught her attention longer than it normally would have. Later that day, she found herself near a music shop without planning to be there. She stood outside for a moment, watching people come and go. Instruments filled the windows, polished and waiting. She didn't go in. Not yet. Instead, she walked on, carrying the feeling with her. She knew rushing could turn hope into pressure. She wanted to move carefully, honestly. Days passed, and the memory of that night stayed with her. Not as a spotlight moment, but as a quiet reminder of who she had been and who she still was. At work, things returned to normal on the surface. Guests came and went. Orders were taken. Tables were cleaned. But something beneath the routine felt new. She carried herself differently. She spoke with a little more confidence. She smiled more freely. One evening, while wiping down the piano area, she lifted the cover again. The restaurant was empty, the lights low. No one was watching. She sat down. She played softly just for herself. No audience. No expectations. The sound filled the empty room gently, like a secret shared between her and the walls. She stopped after a short while and smiled. Felt right. The next week, the manager told her that several guests had asked about the music from that night. Some had returned hoping to hear it again. The manager asked carefully if she would ever consider playing during quiet hours. The question surprised her. She didn't answer right away. She asked for time to think. The manager agreed. That night at home, she finally looked at the contact information. She held it in her hand for a long moment. She thought about fear, about comfort, about risk. She also thought about the feeling of the first note. She didn't make a call, but she didn't throw it away either. She placed it somewhere safe and went to sleep. In the days that followed, she practiced quietly whenever she could. Sometimes at the restaurant after hours. Sometimes imagining the keys in her mind when no piano was near. Each time, the music felt a little closer, a little stronger. She wasn't chasing applause anymore. She was reconnecting with something she had lost. The challenge that night had started as a moment of pressure. It had turned into an opening. She didn't know where it would lead, but she was finally ready to find out. The days continued to pass, steady and quiet, but something inside her stayed awake. Each morning felt a little different now. Not louder, not dramatic, just clearer. She noticed her own thoughts more. She listened to her instincts instead of pushing them aside. Music slowly returned to her life, not as a dream, but as a habit. She practiced when the restaurant was empty, letting the notes move gently through the space. She played softly, sometimes stopping to laugh at a small mistake, sometimes repeating a line just because it felt good. There was no pressure, only honesty. One evening, after closing, the manager stayed behind to listen. The lights were low, and the chairs were stacked. The sound of the piano filled the room again, calm and warm. When she finished, the manager clapped quietly and thanked her. There was no big speech, no promises, just appreciation. A few days later, the manager told her that the restaurant would like to try something new. On certain evenings, during slower hours, live piano music would be welcome. Nothing formal, nothing demanding, only if she felt comfortable. She thought about it carefully. She remembered the fear from that first night, the way her hands had shaken. She also remembered how steady they felt by the final note. She knew she couldn't grow without stepping forward again. She agreed. The first evening she played officially, the room was half full. She wore the same uniform, served her tables, and then moved to the piano when the time came. There was no announcement. She simply sat down and began. The music flowed naturally. Some guests noticed right away. Others realized slowly, as if waking from a thought. Conversations softened. Smiles appeared. The room felt gentle. She didn't look at faces much. She focused on the sound, on keeping it honest. When she finished, a few people clapped. Some thanked her quietly as they left. That was enough. Weeks passed and the routine settled. Serving tables, playing music, cleaning up. Life didn't change overnight, but it moved in a new direction. One afternoon, she finally made the call. Her voice shook at first, but she kept going. The conversation was simple, polite. There were no grand promises, only an offer to meet, to talk, to explore possibilities. She agreed. The meeting was held in a quiet place, away from noise and attention. She listened more than she spoke. She answered questions honestly. She admitted her doubts without shame. The opportunity offered was not instant success. It was guidance, support, a chance to learn again. She accepted. Balancing work and music was not easy. Some days were long. Some nights were tiring. But the effort felt meaningful. Each step forward felt earned. She practiced more seriously now. She learned again. Slowly, patiently. She allowed herself to be a beginner without judgment. There were moments of doubt. Moments when fear returned. But she remembered the first note she had played that night. She remembered how it felt to trust herself. Months later, she stood in a small room filled with quiet listeners. No bright lights, no spotlight, just people who came to hear music. She sat at the piano and took a breath. She played. The sound was fuller now, shaped by time and experience. Not perfect, but real. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, then warm with appreciation. She smiled. Later that night, as she walked home, the city lights reflected softly around her. She thought about the past, about how close she had come to leaving this part of herself behind forever. She realized something important. The challenge had never really been about the piano. It had been about believing she was allowed to step forward. She returned to the restaurant the next day, still a waitress, still herself. But she carried a quiet confidence now. She knew she held more than one role, more than one story. The piano in the corner no longer felt like a memory, felt like a companion. Life continued, steady and real. And this time she was fully present for it.